Good day. There's been less information from the battlefronts in Ukraine over the last 24 hours, but a cascade of reports coming from Bakhmut would suggest that, again, reports of a Ukrainian withdrawal from Bakhmut were premature, and that far from withdrawing their forces from Bakhmut, the Ukrainians still seem to be determined to try and hold on to whatever part of the town that still remains under their control. There's now another estimate, by the way, about the number of Ukrainian troops fighting in Bakhmut. I saw a report a couple of days ago which guesstimated that there were about 7,000. Another report from another official, these are all Russian reports, by the way, put the number of Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut at over 3,000. A third report, which I've seen today, from an actual soldier who's fighting in Bakhmut itself, he seems to be, and from the Wagner organization, by the way, he seems to estimate the total of Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut at 10 to 12,000. Now, I have no way of knowing which of these figures is correct, and I'm not going to try and make a guess. I think this is all very crude rule of thumb thinking. I suspect it is more than 3,000, but probably less than 10 to 12,000, but I'm not going to try and give, as I said, a precise number. The same Wagner Assault Forces soldier who said that he estimated the total number of Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut at 10 to 12,000, has also said that Russia, the Wagner organization, now controls 40% of Bakhmut. He says that all of the areas east of the Bakhmutsky River are effectively under Russian control. Well, we've already known that. And he also says that the Wagner organization has been pressing forward from the north and that they're moving further south towards the center of Bakhmut from that direction. So it looks as if Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut continue to be squeezed, but there is no report of any Ukrainian withdrawal from Bakhmut, no organized withdrawal. In fact, I even saw a report, I think it was in The Guardian, which said that Ukraine, the appearance of the information that we had about Ukrainian troops being pulled out of Bakhmut, it was not a sign of a withdrawal, it was supposedly the normal rotation of troops. In other words, that when a particular unit that's been fighting in Bakhmut for a long time has become exhausted, it's pulled out and then replaced by fresh troops that are sent to hold the line in its place. And this, I presume, supposedly, is what happened to that unit in which that Ukrainian soldier and blogger, who calls himself Madwa, where he apparently serves. Anyway, that's the line that Ukraine would like us to believe. My own impression from what I'm seeing from the battlefronts is that it is a lot less organized, that Ukrainian troops have been trying to exit from Bakhmut, sometimes without orders, sometimes perhaps on orders from local commanders, which perhaps, possibly, have not been cleared from Kiev. That it's been a rather more disorganized affair than this talk about a calm rotation of troops might imply, and that very strange, rather disturbing information I read yesterday about a bridge on the road to Chasiv Yar having been blown up by the Ukrainians, and my speculation that just possibly this was intended not so much to slow the Russians down as to prevent unauthorized withdrawals from Bakhmut. Well, that tends to reinforce that view, I have to say. I ought to say that I've now actually seen more information about the destruction of this bridge. I had perhaps wondered whether I got the road on which this bridge is located wrong, but it turns out it is indeed the road ultimately to Chasov Yar and then to Konstantinovka. It is the road that I thought it was, the one remaining road of life, as some people are calling it, which has been the road that Ukraine has been using to resupply and reinforce its troops in Bakhmut. So, as I said, it does seem a strange decision to blow up a bridge, which appears to, well, if not cut off, at least make much more problematic what, on the face of it, looks like the last line of retreat. And I do wonder whether, as I said, it was done in order to block off the possibility of at least unauthorized retreat. Now, that does beg some rather disturbing questions about Ukraine's calculus. And I have to say, it does all start to resemble, rather worryingly, what happened in Mariupol, where effectively the Ukrainian garrison was abandoned to its fate. The Ukrainians allowed it to be completely cut off, and its remnant ultimately holed up beneath the Azovstal steelworks. They sent lots of assurances that a Ukrainian relief force would eventually come to extricate the troops there, which of course never happened. And at the same time, the Ukrainian leadership repeatedly ordered the troops to continue resisting and rejected all suggestions that the troops surrender and lay down their arms, or even attempt to break out at one point. So it was all a somewhat awful affair, at least in my opinion. And of course, there were all kinds of rationalizations. The Ukrainian general staff said it was all done to parry a Russian advance on Zaporozhye city, an advance which there is no indication that the Russians were seriously entertaining at that time. There were also claims that it was buying Ukraine time for its autumn counteroffensives. Well, those happened, and we've seen that they proved to be completely indecisive, but we seem to be, again, repeating that same pattern. It seems that Ukraine simply cannot allow or face the prospect of ordering its troops to lay down or retreat. And there was a retreat, a very disorganized retreat from Severodonetsk, Lysychansk. But I have to say, I got the impression at the time that this was something of an impromptu affair, and I get the sense that something rather similar may be happening this time, or was happening this time in Bakhmut. And I have to say that it does, at least to me, look a bit like that decision to blow up the bridge on the last remaining exit road may have been intended to stop this as a disorganized flight of troops from Bakhmut. Now, what this means, if we're talking about a rotation of forces and things of that kind, is that the troops that are presumably being withdrawn and those troops that are being presumably sent to replace them, they're having to travel along these country roads and across those fields. And the reports I'm getting is that the ground is still soft. Apparently it's not quite as damp as it was, but it's still pretty soft. So they can't be getting many supplies in. They may be sending men in, but it's difficult to believe that even cross-country vehicles can cross this territory with any ease. And of course, if we're talking about fields, then of course the Russian artillery is within range of all of these fields, and any vehicle that gets stuck in the mud, well, its prospects of survival, I would have thought, are very, very small. And I'm going to guess that if anybody's trying to do that, and I've seen no evidence, by the way, that anybody is, then I'm sure that if a vehicle like that does get stuck, the crew probably abandon it before the inevitable Russian shells home in. So that's, I think, the information we're getting. Now, the Russians are continuing to press towards Homovo and are continuing to press into Ivanovka. And maps now do indeed show the Russians literally, the Wagner organization, assault troops literally on the boundary of Ivanovka. So it's highly likely, I would have thought, that the Russians will indeed break into Ivanovka fairly soon and perhaps storm this village. There was fighting there earlier, but as I said, the Ukrainians did launch a counterattack and did push it back, did push the Russians back for a brief time, weakening the forces they had in the north, holding back the northern pincer. But the road that passes through Ivanovka has always been, or at least has been for the last week or so, unusable because of the close proximity of the Wagner troops and their ability to use not just artillery but anti-tank weapons against vehicles that crisscross this road. And the same now is definitely true of the road further north, the one which goes through Homovo. As I said, it may in theory be a road of life. It might still in theory be possible for Ukrainian troops to move up and down it. But again, any large vehicles are obvious targets, and the Russians are in a position to strike them. So the situation remains extremely bad, very difficult for Ukraine in and around Bakhmut. And perhaps unsurprisingly, there have been some really rather odd reports coming out of the Western media, which perhaps try to avoid facing up to that by talking about unrelated things. Firstly, today's bulletin from the British Ministry of Defence Intelligence Update is a very, very strange one. It's all about the fact that a group of Russian reservists were supposedly ordered to attack a Ukrainian position, fortified Ukrainian position, with small arms and entrenching tools. And we are given a little lecture about how the entrenching tool in question dates from 1869. By the way, I'm not sure that that is the entrenching tool that was being referred to from the Russian report upon which this intelligence update is purportedly based. Anyway, we're then led to think that this all leads to evidence that the Russians are short of artillery. Now, there's no evidence of that, no actual evidence of that I've seen. A couple of weeks ago, there were similar claims that the Russians were reducing the level of their artillery use across the battlefronts, and that this was proof that Russia was experiencing some kind of artillery shortage, except it turned out afterwards, when people did the sums, that this simply wasn't true, that this simply was not the case, and that the claims that there'd been a reduction in Russian artillery strikes was simply wrong. So there we go. It's an odd piece. There's no indication of where this incident happened or when, which makes one wonder whether it occurred at all, and no indication of the one with the tools, the manual tools with which people were supposed to attack this formation. No indication of the provenance of this information, which I must assume must have come from someone in Ukraine. Anyway, an odd bulletin to publish when a battle like Bakhmut is underway, and I think a good sign that the fighting there is going badly, very badly, for Ukraine itself. So there we go. A still deteriorating situation for Bakhmut, for the Ukrainian defenders in Bakhmut. They're having to apparently cross muddy fields and country lanes to get in and out. It's still possible to do that, but the Russians are edging closer. The corridor through which Ukrainian troops can reach Bakhmut is perhaps 3.5 kilometers wide, perhaps even less than that by now. All of it can be covered by Russian artillery. It's a dark picture. And of course, Prigozhin, the nominal head or titular head of the Wagner group, has suggested that the old men and the young people be withdrawn from Bakhmut, but that doesn't appear to be happening, at least in any ordered way. Now, whilst I'm on the topic of Prigozhin, again, there's another report which I've seen in the British media that he's done a video address in which he says that it's the Wagner group that is the glue holding down the entire Russian forces in Donbass, that were it not for the Wagner group, the entire Russian front would collapse, that Ukraine would be on the borders with Russia were that to happen. And again, this has been seized on by some Ukrainian officials and by the media, Western media, as proof that there's some kind of ammunition crisis or that there's severe problems within the Russian military. I have to say that I think this is putting an inordinate amount of weight on Prigozhin's self-aggrandizing, which, as I said already, must be causing a growing amount of irritation within the Russian high command. Now, I'm going to come to the question of the Russian high command in a moment, but let me first of all say that there's also been quite a lot of news further north from the Kupiansk area, and it seems that the Russians are now shelling Ukrainian positions in Kupiansk itself. That's the area of Kupiansk east of the Oskol River, and that they're also in the process of shelling and perhaps even trying to storm various small settlements and villages in close proximity to Kupiansk itself. Again, this is all east of the Oskol River. I'm getting the sense that the Russians are indeed planning some kind of push towards Kupiansk. And this is leading to a whole series of apparent adjustments in the Ukrainian order of battle. I'm seeing some reports that as the situation in Bakhmut deteriorates, Ukraine is redeploying forces from Kharkiv region towards the Bakhmut area to try to set up a new defense line in Chasov Yar, which is this town west of Bakhmut, which will presumably be the next Russian attack point after Bakhmut itself falls, and that those troops that are being withdrawn from Kharkiv region are being replaced by reserve formations made up of recently called up reservists who are basically being rushed to the Kupiansk area in order to try to hold the line there. Now, again, I want to stress this is all very preliminary and it comes from Russian sources. I don't know necessarily that this is the case. It wouldn't surprise me if it was true. And it seems to me that if it is true, it's consistent with the overall Russian strategy, which is to overextend, to stretch Ukrainian lines as much as possible, stretch the Ukrainians as much as possible, cause them the maximum number of losses, deplete their munitions. I was talking yesterday about their artillery problems, and gradually, in the words of those famous words of General Surovikin, about her more in a moment, of back in the autumn, to grind the Ukrainians down. And that seems to be the tactic, and if it is indeed a case of Ukraine shuffling forces in this way, sending in reserve troops to try to hold the line in one place as more effective troops, more trained troops are rushed to another, like a kind of fire brigade, well, that would make sense. And as I said, it gradually exerts more pressure all the time on the Ukrainians right across the front lines. And from a Russian point of view, if these reshuffles are taking place, well, that seems to me to be working. Anyway, that is one report I've seen from the battlefields. There are more reports. There's a whole cascade of reports as well. This is from Ukrainian sources, that some other big Russian missile strike is pending. May I say, we've heard reports from Ukraine about pending missile strikes from the Russians before. They don't always happen when Ukraine predicts they will, but if it does happen, obviously I will cover it. Meanwhile, there has been a big meeting of top Russian commanders, and it's been chaired by the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu. And we have a report about it from the Russian Ministry of Defense. And the report says, Russian Defense Minister holds conference with Special Military Operations Group commanders. And I'll just read the text. It says, Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, General of the Army, Sergei Shoigu, heard the reports of the group commanders on the current situation in the directions of their responsibility and plans for further action. Sergei Shoigu placed the emphasis on creating the necessary conditions for personnel safe accommodation in the field, as well as organizing comprehensive support to the troops, especially from medical and rear units. Earlier, Sergei Shoigu had heard the reports of the deputy defense ministers on the provision of armament, military hardware and ordnance to the troops. Special attention had been drawn to organizing the training, military political activities and other types of comprehensive troop maintenance. That's actually a very, very interesting report indeed. It points to all kinds of things. You need to pass it very carefully, which I'm going to do in a moment. But before I do that, let me say that it has come with a very interesting photographic study, which gives us, I think, a very interesting idea of the actual layout, the actual command structure of the Russian forces in Ukraine. So we get the first photograph is of Shoigu himself. The next photograph is of General Gerasimov, who is the chief of the General Staff and the overall commander. The photograph that immediately follows that shows that sitting next to Shoigu on his right is General Surovikin, who's pointing with some kind of device to what presumably is some kind of automated screen. We're not able to see what it is, but the implication, I suspect, is that it's some kind of map setting out the battlefronts. Then after that, there's another picture in which we see a Russian general, unidentified, I don't know who he is, but he's handing a paper to Shoigu, and again we see Surovikin immediately sitting to Shoigu's right. Then we have Shoigu again, and then there's another picture of Shoigu with Surovikin again to his right, and then there's the next picture, the last in the series, which shows that Shoigu is sitting in the center, Surovikin is sitting immediately to his right, and Gerasimov is sitting immediately to his left, and clearly there's some kind of screen, which is the screen presumably which Surovikin was adjusting with this curious device that he was holding. Anyway, they're obviously the trio of overall commanders: Shoigu, Gerasimov, Surovikin. Now, there's been a huge amount of speculation about the reshuffle that took place a short time ago, about claims that Surovikin had somehow been replaced by Gerasimov, that he was supposedly, allegedly out of favor. And there was even a report that Surovikin, together with Prigozhin and Kadyrov, this is not so much a report, it was a big claim that I read on some website, or rather, that those three, Surovikin, Prigozhin, and Kadyrov, had attempted some kind of internal coup within the Ministry of Defense against Shoigu and possibly Gerasimov as well. Well, these photos demonstrate the absolute untruth of this. Clearly, the photos are going out of their way to show that Surovikin remains arguably the central figure in the actual conduct of military operations on the Russian side in the conflict area. There are more photographs of him than there are of Gerasimov himself. And I'm going to suggest that the situation is, in fact, fully consistent with what I've been saying all along, which is that, yes, Gerasimov has been made the nominal overall commander because the resources committed to this conflict are now so much greater, and that it's Gerasimov's job as Chief of General Staff to ensure that all the forces are properly equipped and supplied and trained before they're sent into battle. But what we see, the way the photos are structured, is that we see first Shoigu and then Gerasimov, and they're clearly being lectured by Surovikin, who is the person who is setting out the plans. That's, as I said, Surovikin with his device, and as I said, there's clearly some kind of screen, which of course we're not shown, where, as I said, the plans are being elaborated. Now, let's go back to the actual readout, and as I said, it's a very interesting readout. The Russians obviously have made sure that it doesn't give too much away, but it does give us some insight into Russian thinking, and you do have to pass it, but it is not particularly difficult to pass. So let's deal with the first paragraph. Shoigu heard the reports of the group commanders on the current situation in the directions of their responsibility and plans for future action. So Surovikin and the area commanders, people like General Muradov, the officer, Colonel General Muradov, the officer in command of the group of Russian forces in the south, in Zaporozhye region, but no doubt all the others as well, they have outlined to Shoigu what their plans are. And of course, it doesn't say plans of attack. They may be plans of defense, but it's difficult, as I said, to believe that some kind of plans of attack are not also being seriously considered as well. Then we have Shoigu himself. He says that he placed the main emphasis on creating all the necessary conditions for personnel's safe accommodation in the field, as well as organising comprehensive support to the troops, especially for medical and rear units. Now, this is intended to reassure troops in the field and their families that the Russian Ministry of Defense is doing everything it possibly can to avoid a similar situation to the one that arose a few weeks ago when a unit of Russian reservists was housed in a building in Makeyevka. The Ukrainians got wind of its presence and launched a HIMARS missile strike, and over 100 of those reservists were killed. Now, I want to say something about that because the BBC and Media Zone have claimed that they found evidence that something like, I think it was about 109 soldiers had been killed in that attack. And they say that this is more than the official figure given by the Russian Ministry of Defense, which was 89. And in a literal sense, that is true. But of course, the figure that the Russian Ministry of Defense gave of 89 was always set out to be a preliminary, provisional figure. It was not the full total, and the figure that the BBC and Media Zone gain is in line with the reports that were coming from Russian sources at the time. So that actually corroborates, again, Russian numbers about their own casualties. And I want to make that point because I'm going to come to the issue of casualties again shortly. And then the next sentence is a very interesting one. Shoigu heard the reports of the deputy defense ministers on the provision of armament, military hardware and ordnance to the troops. Now, the deputy defense ministers were also apparently attending this meeting, and they are the various top officials, the commander of the ground forces, the commander of the real services, all of these people, and they are providing an update about the rearmament, or rather the armament of the forces in the field. So we're talking about armament, military hardware and ordnance. Ordnance, of course, is ammunition. So all the indications are that more and more equipment, including ammunition, is being sent to Russian troops in the field, these large numbers of forces that are gathering. They're in the process of a heavy round of equipment. There's presumably a plan about how to re-equip these forces, and we are given information that Shoigu was briefed about the progress of this particular plan. And then it goes on to say, it finishes, special attention had been drawn to organising the training, military political activities, and other types of comprehensive troop maintenance. Now, I've had a most interesting email from a person who's worked in NATO military structures, in other words, a serving NATO official. I don't want to say anything more that might disclose this person's identity, but it's been a most interesting email, and it was made in response to my discussion of the latest article by Big Serge. And this email discussed the sheer complexities of training and organising forces in advance of a big military campaign. You call up reservists, you obviously need to train them at various levels. Firstly, there's the sort of infantry squad, the fighting squads, then they have to be all brought together, trained in how to work in a platoon. Then they have to learn how to work at company level, which brings together various platoons, because there's the various squads. Then the platoon. The companies have to learn how to work in a battalion, and then the battalion in the regimental structure, if that's how it's going to work, and then of course there's the divisional structure that is being created above them. And this is an enormously complex and very, very difficult task, and it requires an enormous amount of time and resources and high levels of organizational skills. It needs people, the staffs working very properly, and all of these various different parts of an army have to be trained up and coordinated and made to work effectively as a team. And this correspondent referenced me to the memoirs of Marshal Zhukov, who is, of course, the leading Soviet commander of the Red Army during the Second World War, and how Zhukov, in his memoirs, apparently discusses, again, the enormous complexity of training up forces and the time it took for the Soviets to hone their skills in doing it during the Second World War. And it was very interesting reading, very interesting article, and it provided some context to the points that Big Serge was making. Big Serge also says that training and organizing forces on this kind of scale is a very complex undertaking. So reading all of that, I went to my very old editions of John Ericsson's books about the fighting on the Eastern Front during the Second World War. I appreciate that they've been superseded by other more up-to-date books. These were written in the 60s and 70s, though they do have the advantage that they're able to draw on actual interviews of Soviet commanders who actually fought in the war, whereas more senior, more recent books, like those by Glantz, who is, I accept, much more up-to-date and has a better understanding of all of this. Anyway, he probably doesn't have that advantage that Ericsson does. But at least one thing became very clear from checking out this book, which I remember reading way back in the 70s, which is that Soviet offensives in the Second World War happened at intervals. They weren't, it's a misconception to think that the Soviets, once they gained the initiative from the Germans, were attacking all the time. The way it basically happened was that the Soviets would build up their forces. There'd be months sometimes of relative quiet on the front lines. They'd build up their forces, train them, equip them, build up huge ammunition stocks, and then they'd launch a huge offensive that would cover a lot of ground, that would destroy lots of German divisions. The supplies that had been built up, however, would eventually run down. The Soviet units, the Red Army units, would suffer losses. Eventually, the offensive would run out of steam and would slow down, stop, and then the whole process would have to repeat itself all over again. That the Soviets would then have to resupply their troops, reinforce them with fresh reservists, freshly trained reservists, once again replace and repair systems, weapons that had been knocked about, lost, whatever, and once again build up their supplies of fuel and ammunition, and also, by the way, organize fresh logistic chains and transport links to the troops at the front, given that they would have outpaced their previous supply lines. So you'd have a sort of series of sort of staggered offensives. And of course, in the meantime, the fronts would be either idle, or the Germans would sometimes use these intervals of relative quiet to launch counterattacks, though the Soviets were always able, ultimately, to parry those counterattacks because they always had significant numbers of troops in the field. Now, nothing is ever exactly the same, and I don't want to push this too far. No doubt war today is different, but I do wonder whether, in light of that article by Big Serge and this extremely interesting email that I've received, whether we're seeing something of the same kind. And this readout of this meeting by the top military commanders of the Russian military rather suggests it. So the Russians are still in the process of training up their forces. It's a long incremental process, but it is being done. They're still in the process of equipping them. There's still discussions about that. There's concerns that something like the Makeyevka incident shouldn't repeat itself, and Shoigu goes out of his way to talk about that, and we see that emphasis is given to it. But we also see that the theatre commanders have their plans, and they presumably include both defence and offence. And we see also that Surovikin himself remains in overall charge of situations on the battlefront. Now, Gerasimov's job as the Chief of the General Staff and as the person who is now overall commander is to supervise that very complex process of training troops, organizing them, creating these divisions, creating these regiments out of all these called up reservists, making sure that they're properly equipped with the right levels of armament, making sure that ammunition stocks and fuel stocks are sufficient for whatever is being planned. And that's why he's been brought in. And that's why he was appointed overall commander. It seems to me this readout and this photographic study are extremely useful, and they provide, if you like, the corroboration to that article by Big Serge and to that email that I received, both of which, by the way, came before this readout from the Ministry of Defence appeared. So that's what I'm going to say about this topic. Much more is coming. We'll see when it is. My increasing suspicion is that the Russians are quite happy for the moment with the way things are going. They're continuing to grind the Ukrainians down. They might very well elect to absorb the blow if the Ukrainians are unwise enough to launch their counteroffensive, which presumably they are. But nobody should be in any doubt that eventually some big blow is indeed coming. And we'll see what form it takes, but no doubt that will be pretty devastating when it does. Now, I do want to discuss briefly the question of casualties. Now, over the last couple of days, and it's one that I've been bombarded with questions about, there's been a series of reports that I've seen that about a report allegedly on CNN which outlined the extent of Ukrainian casualties. And the figures that were given were huge. And I've seen also what appears to be a screenshot of the broadcast by CNN where these numbers were given. Now, I have to say I found no accompanying article by CNN. I didn't see that broadcast myself. I can't confirm the truth of this report. And for that reason, I'm not going to discuss it any further, except to say that the numbers that have been quoted seem to me on the high side, exceeding as they do those claimed, as far as I can see, by the Russian Ministry of Defense itself. So I'm not saying they're necessarily wrong, but as I said, I'm skeptical about the provenance of this report. I haven't seen it itself, the original from CNN. And as I said, it seems unlikely to me that the Russian Ministry of Defense would be downplaying numbers. However, as some people have pointed out, in its latest bulletins, the Russian Ministry of Defense has been increasing the numbers of Ukrainian troops that the Russian Ministry of Defense is claiming have been killed on any particular day has been rising. And we're now having regular reports from the Russian Ministry of Defense about over 600 Ukrainian troops killed in any one day. Now, I think that is plausible. Obviously, these are Russian claims, and we must always take Russian claims skeptically. But they are consistent with some figures that we've been seeing about Ukrainian losses, which are independent of that one that I spoke about. And they are also consistent with some of these very distressing claims that there have been about the overall state of losses that have been taking place in Ukraine. And there was a really very disturbing, very upsetting article in The Guardian a couple of days ago by a Ukrainian activist, as far as I could tell, somebody who, by the way, strongly supports the Maidan movement, was bitterly critical of President Putin, bitterly critical of his government, who talks about Russia pursuing a war of genocide against Ukraine. I don't see any evidence of that at all, by the way. But it spoke about, it asked the rhetorical question, does the West, does Europe want a Ukraine of dead heroes or of living partners? An interesting rhetorical question, one which wasn't answered, and it wasn't clear to me, by the way, what this person was expecting Europe to do. But anyway, she spoke really very distressingly. I'm not going to read the article, by the way. Very distressingly about how the largest numbers of Ukrainian flags that you see nowadays in Ukraine are those you find in cemeteries. And I think that is true. And I'm getting the sense that numbers of Ukrainians being killed on any one day are indeed rising, and that Ukrainian losses are now reaching absolutely horrendous levels, probably exceeding the worst that we saw in the summer, and probably on at least the same level as we saw during the bloodiest months of the Ukrainian Kherson offensive of the autumn. So it was a actually extremely distressing article, and as I said, I'm not going to say more about it. The BBC and Media Zone, by the way, have provided a further update on Russian losses. They've increased the total number of Russians, they say, Russian forces, they say, have suffered casualties to around 16,000. I'm not going to discuss again these reports. The methodology, again, seems to me sound. I'm becoming skeptical that there's a vast hidden pool of Russians, dead Russians, that are not being tracked, that have not been found. I don't understand how that would be the case. And there has definitely been an uptick in Russian casualties as well, which is also, by the way, distressing. But again, I do get the sense that these losses don't remotely compare with those that Ukraine is suffering. Bernhard at the Moon of Alabama says that on the worst estimate, Russia loses as many men in a week as Ukraine loses in a day, and that the ratio of losses is 10 Ukrainians for every Russian. Well, that's his calculation. It may very well be true. But anyway, it's all very, very disturbing, very upsetting. And of course, always bear in mind that the Russians are able to absorb these losses from a vastly bigger manpower pool than the one available to Ukraine. And I'm not going to get into those levels of figures, but obviously Russia has a much bigger population than Ukraine, and the available manpower pool Ukraine anyway has been reduced further by emigration and that sort of thing, and it's probably even smaller, probably significantly smaller than some Western commentators think. Anyway, I'm going to move on, and I'm now going to discuss a completely different subject, which is the Russian economy. I've been reading a whole slew of reports, all based, by the way, as far as I can tell, on those January budget figures. I knew this would happen, which imply that the situation of the Russian economy is, again, catastrophic, that things are going badly wrong for the Russians, and that things are going from bad to worse. And a lot of commentators in the West have seized on certain comments made by the Russian businessman, oligarch, if you prefer, Deripaska, in which he said that Russia is at real risk of running out of money in 2024. I wouldn't take anything that Deripaska says on that topic seriously. It could be that he's at risk of running out of money by 2024. He's a rather complex individual, no friend of Vladimir Putin's. In fact, there was a notorious incident that took place at the time of the 2008 crisis, in which Putin effectively humiliated Deripaska in public before his own workers, which I'm not going to discuss in this program. But, I mean, basing what you think is happening to the Russian economy on what someone like Deripaska thinks is frankly desperate. But anyway, we've now had a slew of figures, and they give us some insight as to what is actually happening in the real Russian economy, as opposed to the fictional one that we often read about. Now, the first thing to say is that the finance minister, Anton Siluanov, has come forward. He said that revenue has been higher over the course of January and February of this year than it was over the same period last year. Now that suggests, we haven't got final figures, that there's been a significant build-up in receipts in February, and that the January drop in revenue must have been an anomaly. The Russian Finance Ministry has said that energy revenue in March is going to be $1 billion or so below target, easily covered by the Russians. The Russians expect overall, nonetheless, that their budget deficit for the whole year will be around 2% of GDP, which is something Russia can comfortably afford, as we're going to see. But anyway, we have a whole list, as I said, of economic reports. I'm going to go back again to comments that Siluanov has said. Now, he's given an interview to RT, and he said that the financial, Siluanov, this is the finance minister, says that the financial and macroeconomic situation is being stabilized as intended. And he says, we have managed to stabilize inflation. We hope that the measures that were taken last year and are being taken now will make it possible to stabilize the economic macroeconomic situation, the financial situation this year as well. This year, we see that so far everything is going according to plan. And he added that the stability of the macroeconomic situation was certainly influenced by the fact that we have a system of floating exchange rate and targeted inflation. So everything, according to Siluanov, is going according to plan. Things are looking good. That's what Siluanov says, and he is, after all, the finance minister. He should know. And we've had more information as well, and this is about GDP dynamics, and these come from the economy ministry. And we read as follows, and again, I'm taking this from TASS. The decline of the national of GDP geared down to 3.2% year on year in January 2023, after having been 4.2% last December, the Russian Ministry of Economic Development said in its current price review. Seasonally adjusted GDP gained 0.2% monthly, and we then have a report. We have the actual text of what the economics ministry said. In January 2023, the economy continues recovering. According to the estimate of the Ministry of Economic Development, GDP moved up by 0.2% in monthly terms, with a seasonal adjustment. In annual terms, GDP decline decelerated to 3.2% after the drop by 4.2% in December 2022. Overall, the GDP decline in 2022 was 2.1% as of year end. And we then go on to see that the ministry's official outlook continues to predict a GDP decline in 2023 of 0.8%. I'm going to come to that in a moment. So the first thing to say about this is that there was a anticipated fall in output in December. Now, this doesn't mean that the December output in Russia was lower than it had been in November. It means that output in December 2022 was 4.2% lower than it had been in December 2021. And the reason for that is that in December 2021 and in the first 3 months of, or the first 2 months especially, of 2022, before the sanctions were imposed, the Russian economy was accelerating. It was actually growing quite fast. So even though economic activity was stable in December 2022 as compared to November 2022, year on year, output in December 2022 was 4.2% lower than it had been in December 2021. What this doesn't make clear is that this was a lower fall, that this was a smaller year-on-year decline in December 2022 as compared with December 2021 than the Russian authorities had been anticipating. they'd expected that because of the high growth in December 2021 and in January and February last year, that the difference would be greater. And that is why the overall GDP contraction in 2022 turned out to be only 2.1%, lower than the 2.5 or 2.9% that various branches of the Russian government had been predicting just a few weeks earlier. And what we learn from this report is that the economic recovery is continuing. Economic activity in January was, according to early estimates, 0.2% higher in January than it was in December. Now, I should say that January is often a difficult month in Russia, but it's nonetheless the case that the economy is growing, the actual real economy is growing, and though economic activity in January 2023 was lower than in January 2022, when, as I said, the economy was growing strongly, the difference was only 3.2% as opposed to the 4.2% between December 2023 and December 2022. So we see that the Russian economy is on a rising arc. And moreover, that brings us to the official outlook, the official forecast from the Economics Ministry for a decline of 0.8% in 2023. That is an old forecast. It dates from significantly earlier, some months ago. And these figures about GDP dynamics appear to be in line with these latest figures about GDP dynamics appear to be in line with the predictions from the IMF that Russia will actually achieve growth in 2023 of 0.3%. So the Russian economy does seem to be returning to a stable growth pattern, and though there's still a lot of work to do and things are still complex overall, even though the growth probably this year will be on fairly low, it will still be growth, and we could be looking at significantly higher growth in years after that. And we see further news. We have news about inflation. And again, this comes from the Economics Ministry. And again, I take this from TASS. Annual inflation in Russia decelerated to 11.01% over the week from February 21st to 27th, compared to 11.3% a week earlier, the Ministry of Economics said in its current price review. And that's a misleading set of figures, and we're going to find out in a moment why. Prices dropped by 0.02% over the week from February 21st to 27th. In annual terms, the rise in prices slowed down to 11.01%, the ministry said. The price drop for foods on account of fruits and vegetables and other food made the main input on the decline in prices. Deflation was also recorded in the services sector amid the decrease in domestic airfare and prices for sanatorium and recreation services. Prices stayed flat in the non-food sector. So, let's go back to this. Prices in Russia are 11% higher than they were a year ago, but this is very largely because of the surge in prices that took place in the first two quarters of 2022, when immediately after the imposition of the sanctions. That means that is disguising the fact that inflation in Russia has largely run its course and prices are either flat or falling. And we're seeing certain phenomena now begin to take form. We see, first of all, that airfares, the prices for fruit and vegetables is to some extent coming down. Now that, by the way, is unusual in Russia in winter. Usually there's a price rise in food prices. This year, presumably because of the abundant harvest last year, food prices in Russia have continued to fall. A stark contrast, by the way, to the situation in Britain, but I'm not going to talk about that in this program. But we are seeing other prices also falling, and there's been a fall in airfares. Now, this is very interesting because as part of the original sanctions, the Russian airline industries were especially severely targeted. Decisions were made under pressure from the European Commission by the various suppliers of spare parts to stop the supply of spare parts to Russian airlines. And in fact, we also saw that the various leasing companies that had leased jets, aircraft to Russian airlines, they tried to force the Russians to return those those jets. Well, the Russian airliners refused to return the jets. There was all kinds of complex negotiations followed. And by the way, for the record, as I understand it, that's all been now settled. And what's happened is that the Russians have basically bought those jets. They bought them outright. Now, as to repairs, the Russian airlines have cannibalized some of their aircraft to make sure that most of their fleets continue to fly. That's by no means unusual, by the way. And they've also undoubtedly been able to source spares from other places, even though most of the aircraft they fly are Boeing and Airbus aircraft. The net result is that the Russian airlines have around 450 aircraft flying, as opposed to the 500 that they had when the sanctions were first imposed. Now, bear in mind that they're prevented from accessing destinations in the West because of the sanctions. So the number of aircraft they can use on domestic flights and in flights to friendly countries has actually become greater. And that explains why there's been a fall in airfares. By the way, the Russians have ambitious plans to move towards a steady replacement of all of these Western aircraft. They're now busy bringing Russian aircraft like the Tupolev 214, the Russian MS-21 and the Sukhoi Superjet into service, and they got plans to increase production of all of these aircraft very significantly, and we should probably start to see some expression of that over the next year or so, perhaps over the course of 2023, when I believe the MS-21 will be entering full-scale production. The Tupolev 24, I believe, is already in full-scale production. Anyway, more about all of that in some other day. But the key point to say is that despite the fact that prices in Russia today are still 11% higher than they were a year ago because of that surge of prices that took place in the first 2 quarters of 2022. Actual prices, actual price dynamics on a day-to-day basis are now flat. Inflation in Russia has run its course, and we're starting to see the prices of some goods are now falling or are continuing to fall. Come April, we are going to see a tumble, a steady tumble in inflation. Inflation will fall back first to single figures and probably very close by mid-year, or so it seems at the moment, to its 4% target. It's quite plausible that inflation will be lower in Russia by year's end than it will be in the West. I say that because recent inflation readouts in the West have pointed to a re-acceleration of inflation. That's been a topic I've discussed with my colleague Alex Christoforou in a program we've done for the Duran, which you can soon find. Now, the Finance Ministry is predicting that Russia will be able to sell more oil and gas over the course of 2023 than it did last year. And he says that I would like to note that these bans, embargoes on imports of Russian oil and oil products have led, first of all, to a situation where such energy commodities have become more expensive in the very same countries that impose those sanctions. And we've seen the emergence of new suppliers who charge more due to new logistics. And indeed, I was just reading a report just a short time ago that North Africa is now importing Russian diesel oil, of which there is now a shortage in Europe, and is re-exporting it to Europe at elevated prices. And then he says, if you look at the volume of our hydrocarbon production of the past year, not only has it not declined, but it has grown. And we hope that this trend will continue this year as well. Now, he's being a little bit over-optimistic here because, of course, the Russians recently announced a reduction of oil production by 500,000 barrels a day, though quite plausibly and quite probably that will be ended at some point this year, as surging demand for oil in Asia, in China especially, increases demand for oil from Russia. But we'll come to that later. But then Siluanov then talks about the budget, and he makes some points here about Russian budget dynamics, which are very important and need to be understood. He said, we have pursued a responsible budgetary policy. This includes both a budget regulation and a low debt level. At the beginning of this year, our debt amounted to 15.1% of GDP. 15.1% of GDP. Compare that with the United States, France, Britain, where it's well over 100% now. Japan, I believe it's something like 250%. Germany, it's about 70%. In Russia's case, it's 15.1% of GDP. And then he goes on to say this represents our advantage, which gives us the option to maneuver in terms of financial market transactions and the option of borrowing to finance future budget expenditures. And then he went on to say that disconnecting Russia from such international systems as SWIFT, MasterCard and Visa have not affected the stability of domestic money transfers. We have our own system created by the Central Bank of Russia for the transmission of financial messages. Therefore, all such decisions to disconnect us from SWIFT or from the Visa and MasterCard systems have not had an impact on our internal transactions, on internal payments at all. And about that, he's absolutely right. Now, as I said, again, coming back to that readout of, a big Russian budget deficit in January, which we've seen might have fallen in February, might slightly tick up again in March, but it will probably fall again. Well, a country with just 15% debt to GDP ratio is not going to be bothered by a blip in 1 month. And by the way, I've been reading a great deal about a windfall tax that the Russian government is raising on some countries that had excessive, unusually high profits in 2022. Windfall taxes are always controversial. The libertarians in the United States detest them for all sorts of reasons, pretty good ones. Russia regularly imposes windfall taxes on companies. The windfall tax that's going to be imposed, well, we've been given the numbers. It's going to raise around $4 billion. That's against budget revenues, average budget revenues in any 1 year of $360 billion in Russia. It's a relatively small amount. It's not a major burden either on business, and it's not going to make any big difference to the budget. The reason the government has done it is because, well, it regularly imposes windfall taxes, and it does it in order to fund specific out-of-budget programs which it's considering. And I'm not going to discuss that in more detail, but it's a interesting subject. And lastly, well, penultimately, we've also had figures for January about electricity consumption. Electricity consumption is often a very good indicator of economic growth. And we've learned that in January, energy consumption, electricity consumption in Russia was 1.3% above what it was in January 2022. Now, bear in mind, it's been a relatively mild winter in Russia as well. They have had some cold and they have had some snow. And the fact that there's been a significant increase in electricity use in Russia in January of this year, as opposed to January of last year, may be a sign that, in fact, the earlier GDP numbers still showing GDP in January 2023 as below January 2022 might be wrong, and that, in fact, there might have been faster growth in GDP in January than the figures are yet saying. It needs to be stressed again that the GDP dynamic numbers that we've had for January are preliminary, and these figures for electricity consumption may suggest that they're on the low side. Anyway, there is one other factor which cannot be underestimated and which may also suggest that we are going to look at increased Russian economic growth, not just this year, but going forward. And that is that the central bank appears to be changing its underlying policies. Since 2011, it has been overwhelmingly focused on bringing inflation down. Inflation in Russia, after the period of the Soviet collapse, remained at double-digit numbers right up until about 2011, 2012. The central bank then started to tighten monetary policy and did so very severely in order to reduce inflation. And at one point, as I very well remember, it was running interest rates which were 5% above inflation, which, let me assure you, is a far more severe interest rate policy than anything we're seeing at the West at the moment. Anyway, the result is that inflation has indeed steadily fallen in Russia, and we see that inflation is continuing to fall. If we discount the blip that took place in 2022 after the imposition of the sanctions, we're seeing that inflation is remaining overall subdued in Russia. It looks as if the central bank is gradually coming round to the view that inflation, that it has won the inflation battle. And its chair, Elvira Nabiullina, has now said that the economy now requires substantial additional resources. Funding must be directed to the most essential and sought after areas of economic development. To that end, together with the Russian government, we have devised a program to encourage risk-sensitive regulation for initiatives of technological sovereignty and economic structural adaptation. And she added, and again, I think this again from TASS, that the program might start working before the end of the year. Now that suggests that the central bank, very carefully and very prudently, is now moving from a stance of prioritizing inflation reduction to one of supporting the economy and prioritizing economic growth. And given that, as I have explained on numerous occasions, the single most important factor in restricting Russian economic growth between 2011 and just a few years ago was the very tight monetary policy that the central bank was imposing. This could lead, this change of priorities could result in an acceleration of economic growth in Russia over the medium term. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. I don't want to make it appear that all is well with the Russian economy, but these are actual figures. They're not, as I say, murmurings by some oligarch or calculations done by some academic in some Western university. These are actual real figures, and they give us a snapshot of how the Russian economy is doing. It's still got many problems going forward, but as Siluanov said, the situation is stabilizing. The overall state of the economy is getting stronger. Well, this has been an unusually long video, even by my standards. This is where I stop. And there'll be more from me soon. And just to remind you again, you can find all of our programs on our various other channels, on our various other platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can also check out our shop. You find the great things that you will see there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those things. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel.